In the summer of 1947, something fell from the sky outside the high desert of Roswell, New Mexico. The Army Air Force immediately issued a press release calling it a flying disc. Then, almost overnight, they changed the story. They told the public to stop looking. It was only a weather balloon. 47 years later, the government revised the official record one last time. They released a definitive 1994 report claiming the debris actually belonged to a highly classified program called Project MOGUL. This photograph shows the scale of the high-altitude research balloons used in that project being inflated by a military crew. But 5 years before that final report was published, a man named Chester Alroy Mabin sat down in front of a camera. He was a field recovery specialist with the 509th Bomb Group, and he was dying of pancreatic cancer. Believing he had nothing left to lose, he broke 42 years of absolute silence. Over the course of an 8-hour interview, Mabin laid out what he saw in the desert in careful, unhurried detail. The sequence of events he described systematically dismantles the tidy, finalized explanation the public was asked to accept. When people construct a lie, they tend to make it cinematically perfect. A fabricated story usually hits all the expected narrative beats and produces the exact imagery a listener anticipates. It makes logical sense. Authentic human memory works differently. Real eyewitness testimony is filled with the wrong details. A person recalling a genuine chaotic event will fixate on peripheral, illogical things that do nothing to support a clean narrative. We are going to look closely at Mabin's confession. We aren't just looking at the broad strokes of what he claimed to see, but the specific involuntary precision with which he described it. The most compelling evidence in his account lives in the microscopic, frankly bizarre observations he makes. He notes sensory shifts and odd traits that are entirely devoid of UFO cliches, things that a man excavating a true memory could not simply invent. The very first thing is a geographic anomaly. His unit was directed to a secondary site, a location with zero footprint in any declassified record, positioned precisely 3 miles to the southeast of the primary debris field. When he arrived, he found the impact zone lacked a crater. Instead, the ground was gently depressed as if something heavy had settled deliberately. The desert brush was flattened outward in a perfect 60-foot radial pattern. Resting in the center was a disc-shaped craft spanning roughly 30 to 40 feet in diameter. Magaban noted it was largely intact on the eastern side, while the western edge had partially collapsed under its own weight. He struggled to describe the hull's surface. It wasn't metallic or constructed from separate panels. There were no seams, absolutely no rivets, and no signs of assembly. He used the word integrated, describing a structure that looked as though it had grown into its shape. Fabricating a 30-foot rigid structure entirely without seams or joints was completely beyond human material science. In 1947, aerospace engineers working with advanced composites confirmed that even today, manufacturing a hull like that remains an impossibility. Rather than describing the ship's technology, Magaban kept returning to strange sensory gaps. At what was supposed to be a severe crash site, he pointed out a total lack of fire. There was no smoke and absolutely no smell of fuel or propellant. Instead, he fixated on an odor he couldn't identify. He described a persistent scent, distinctly organic, yet possessing a sharp electrical quality. When ordered to step inside the breached hull, he experienced an extreme acoustic dampening. The space was so unnaturally silent that Magaban vividly remembered the sound of his own breathing noticeably changing, echoing with a strange, unfamiliar resonance. A person fabricating a sci-fi story focuses on flashing lights and control panels. Noting highly specific, disorienting shifts in smell and sound is the psychological signature of a human mind trying to process a deeply unusual reality. Deep inside the eastern section of the craft, Magaban encountered the crew. There were 3 of them. He carefully noted that 2 were gone, a deliberate distinction from the word dead, but the third entity was actively moving and alive. This is where Magaban aggressively rejects standard pop culture tropes. He explicitly states the entity was not childlike, and he goes out of his way to clarify that the skin was absolutely not gray. He described highly compact frames standing roughly 4 feet tall, supporting a head that was large relative to the body, though not wildly exaggerated. The skin tone was a biological pale, the color of living tissue that had never in its existence been exposed to sunlight. The physical detail he recalled with the most practice, being designed for a purpose he couldn't begin to guess.
McAbain struggled to explain the entity's presence. He recognized a quality of active interiority, the signature of a living mind assessing him. He had seen death many times, but this was a consciousness for which he simply had no earthly vocabulary. Within 10 minutes, that brief observation window slammed shut. Vehicles arrived from the north, carrying men in civilian clothes who moved with ruthless military precision. They immediately pushed McAbain's unit back and established a perimeter, not around the craft, but around the witnesses. For 6 hours, the recovery team was isolated. A quiet man interviewed them one by one, asking hyper-specific questions about exactly what they saw and touched inside the hole. But as they answered, the man wrote absolutely nothing down. He created no paper trail. That strict avoidance of documentation extended to the entire base. Following July 4, 1947, there is an inexplicable 3-day gap in the mundane, everyday administrative paperwork of the 5009th Bomb Group, a silence that historians call a structural anomaly. Yet the coordinates survive elsewhere. Decades later, a retired nurse and a former communications technician independently left behind statements describing a secondary southern field site. Both placed the location precisely 3 miles southeast of the primary zone. The military effectively erased the physical evidence from the desert floor, but by halting routine paperwork and silencing, they left behind a perfectly shaped bureaucratic void. That vast, silent gap in the records lines up flawlessly with McAbain's timeline. To understand what happened in that desert, we have to return to the 3 solitary minutes spent inside the faintly luminescent hall, standing mere feet from the living entity. When the interviewer finally asked if the being communicated, McAbain's composure broke.
He described a sudden shift in his own understanding, where knowledge appeared in his mind fully formed, though he could find no path by which it had arrived. The content of that transference was stark. He understood that the entity was deeply surprised it had survived the impact, yet amidst the wreckage of its ship, it was completely devoid of fear. Mabin realized the being was simply waiting, wasn't reaching out or asking for help. It sat in the quiet of the depressed earth, radiating a heavy patience that he described as feeling older than biology itself. This is the only moment in 8 hours of tape where Mabin's language completely fails him. A man who had been articulate for hours suddenly sounds lost, as if the memory itself is too large for the words available to him. The morning after the recovery, Mabin watched the final stages of the erasure from a comfortable holding room at the Roswell airfield. This image shows the sprawling footprint of that base, where Mabin observed heavy wooden containers being loaded onto the tarmac. The crew handled them with extreme positional caution, as if the cargo responded biologically to its orientation. The strange, heavy containers were carefully loaded into an aircraft matching the profile in this photo, an unmarked military C-54 Skymaster. Once it took off, Mabin never learned where it landed. 3 months after detailing that morning, Chester Mabin died. 5 years later, the journalist who recorded him suffered a fatal heart attack, and shortly after that, the original 8-hour VHS tapes completely disappeared from storage, leaving only partial transcripts behind. The recovery team encountered a living mind possessing an incomprehensibly old patience. By choosing fear, strict classification, and bureaucratic silence, humanity actively squandered that contact. It forces us to ask what fragments of understanding we threw away in the desert and what exactly might still be waiting in a nameless facility today.